Okay, good afternoon and welcome to session 5 of the Spring-Summer 2018 Sunoikisis Digital Classics seminar. The subject this week is Markup. This is the second of 2 sessions on Markup, and this week we'll be talking about EpiDoc and Papyri.info. And what we will do is I will give a brief introduction, and then we will have a series of short explanations followed by demos of a couple of different activities using EpiDoc and using Papyri.info and using Leiden Plus. I will, most of the interesting content, needless to say, will come from Simona, Stoyanova and Lucia Vannini in this session. I will be the annoying head that pops up in the middle, distracting and asking questions as usual. So I will start with a few slides. Give me just a second. Okay. And so yes, as I said, this is the second session on Markup. What we're going to talk about in this session, I will give a brief introduction to XML well-formedness. We talked about 2 weeks ago in the first session on Markup. We talked about Markup in general and adding tags to text. To add structure and semantics to the text. And we didn't specifically insist that those tags had to be XML tags. So I will just briefly give a reminder of the rules of XML. If you add tags that follow these rules, then you are by default using XML. So that's where we'll start. I will then again give a reminder of what the Leiden Conventions are. We looked at those again 2 weeks ago already, and how those map to EpiDoc and what that means. Then Simona will take over and she will show some complex issues in EpiDoc, some of the interesting features of encoding restorations and encoding resolutions of abbreviations, for example. And she will give a quick demo of then mapping a Leiden encoded epigraphic text to a EpiDoc encoded text. Then Lucia will talk about the Papyri.info platform, and in particular the Papyrological Editor, which is a part of that. And she will give a demonstration of encoding a text, this time a papyrological text, using Leiden Plus, which will result in an EpiDoc encoded text, but Leiden Plus is a much more user-friendly interface to do so. And finally, I will suggest a practical exercise that students can do, which is encoding some Apparatus Criticals entries using Leiden Plus to put some corrections recorded in the Berichtigungsliste into the Duke databank of documented papyri. So if you do these exercises as we suggest, you will be actively contributing to the premier papyrological resource that scholars use. So this will be an active research contribution. So let me just start off talking about XML well-formedness. This is, as I say, a set of very straightforward 5 rules that if you mark up your text using those tags encircled in angle brackets, as we saw last time, and as you experimented with in Oxygen XML Editor. If these rules are followed, then it is well-formed XML. If it's not well-formed XML, then it's technically not XML, right? It cannot be parsed as XML by a parser. So the first rule, and this is fairly obvious, that because the angle brackets delimit tags and the ampersand character delimits entities, which we haven't really talked about, but these are characters which either cannot be recorded in Unicode or cannot be typed on an ordinary keyboard, so you can represent them as a numerical entity, for example. Or they're special characters which have special meanings when they're typed literally. those three characters cannot appear in plain text in your XML file in between the tags, because they would be interpreted as being the beginnings or ends of tags or the beginnings of entities. And so any of those characters must be escaped, as we say. They must be represented using entities, and so that's the main purpose of the entity there, is to, when you want an opening angle bracket but you don't want it to start a tag, you instead encode it as the entity for an opening angle bracket, which is an ampersand LT and then a semicolon to close it. So, but the summary of that rule is that those three characters can't be used as normal characters in the text of an XML file because they have special meanings. The second rule is that if you open a tag and it is not an empty tag that has no content, then it must close again. And in combination with the third rule, this basically means that when you open a tag inside another element, that tag has to close again, still inside that other element. You cannot begin inside an element, close the containing element, and then close the new element outside it, because you will end up with tags that overlap one another. And I think everybody's seen an example of that and seen how that doesn't work when you attempt to encode it. So this is the principle of clean nesting. Any element that is partly inside another element must be completely inside it. The fourth rule is that the whole document, a single XML document, must have one element that contains the entire document. So the opening tag at the very beginning of the document, immediately after the XML declaration, that opening tag must match a closing tag, which is right at the end of the document. And there can be nothing before the opening tag except for the XML declaration, and nothing after the closing tag. There can be all sorts of things in between, but there must be one root element that contains everything. And the final rule is that attribute values that you have on XML tags may not contain markup themselves. So they can also not contain angle brackets or entities that are not escaped. So that's the general set of rules for well-formedness. I haven't gone in great detail as to what how you structure, how you construct XML tags, because you've all tried that out last week, and I think everybody got the idea of that. But there's these 5 basic rules, in addition to the fact that tags are made out of angle brackets, that are important. And sometimes you'll see an error in your XML and you'll think, well, it doesn't look wrong to me, and it's because of one of these 5 rules. So that's why I've labored on those a little bit. The second thing I want to talk about just briefly is, we talked again about the Leiden Conventions. This is a slide which I showed you 2 weeks ago. And Leiden is, as we said then, a markup language, right? We use arbitrary symbols to indicate semantic meanings. If we have text that is surrounded by square brackets, as here, that means that those characters were, we believe, originally written on the support we are transcribing, but they are now lost. And so we are restoring them. And sometimes it's very obvious. You know, if you have the word conventions and the T is broken off, you can pretty much guess that it's a T. And so you write the T in square brackets. Sometimes we have to guess a little bit more wildly as to what's in there, but that's editorial decisions. If the characters are entirely lost from the stone, and we believe they used to be there, we surround them in square brackets. If there are characters lost from the stone, entirely lost from the stone, that we cannot restore because there's just too much missing, we can't guess what was there, it's a whole word or whatever, then we use the same symbol, the same square brackets. They mean characters are missing, but instead of having characters inside, we have a row of dots inside, or sometimes a row of dashes if we're saying there's a long span of text that we don't know how long it is missing. And so this is similar for most of the other set of rules you see on here. The dots on their own mean there are illegible letters. Dots under characters mean these characters are ambiguous outside their context, but they are in a context, and so we can transcribe them. With the angle brackets, with the dots in there, means there is clearly something missing here. We don't know what. With characters inside the angle brackets, it means there is clearly something missing here. Missing because the scribe or stonecutter who wrote the text erroneously omitted it, not because it's been damaged since, but we know what they would have written if they hadn't forgotten. And so we can put that in there in angle brackets. And we have parentheses that mark the expansion of an abbreviation, the resolution of an abbreviation. We have these curly braces representing letters which were written on the stone or on the original support, but we think the stonecutter wrote them there or the scribe wrote them there in error. They're superfluous, so we want to remove them. And the double square brackets, the last example on here, are characters that where they were written on the stone and then the editor or a later, the scribe or a later scribe came along and removed those characters from the stone, either removed them or indicated somehow that they were meant to be ignored, a strike through or under dots to show that these should be deleted. So if we can still read them, but we can see that the original scribe intended them to be deleted, we can mark them with these double square brackets as such. So that's the markup language that is Leiden. And there's a couple of links at the bottom there to various other places where you can go and find out more about Leiden. I've given a very, very, very simplified version of it here. This Leiden is, as I say, an arbitrary symbolic representation of the semantics of what's going on in the edition. And EpiDoc is another symbolic arbitrary representation of the semantics of what go on in the edition, but EpiDoc follows exactly the same semantic distinctions as Leiden. It just uses different symbols for them. It uses XML to represent those pieces of information, and you can see in this slide a few the same Leiden examples with a demonstration of what the XML equivalent would be of these encodings. So you see the one we started with again, the square brackets around some characters. Instead of using square brackets, as in Leiden, EpiDoc uses this element called supplied with an attribute reason with a value of lost. And this unambiguously says that these are characters which the editor has restored because they are entirely lost from the support originally, but they were there originally. They have now been lost. So I won't go through this list in any more detail because this some of these examples Simona will tell you about. But just to show, you can see the match from on the left to the XML on the right in there. Do note one feature of this is that where the Leiden includes some characters, so in most of these cases, all but the three that are represented by dots, this means that we are including something in our edition that is in some way unclear, uncertain, missing, restored, or otherwise to be commented on in the markup. And those characters remain the same in XML. It's the brackets and sigla around them that change to XML tags. In the case of those that are a row of dots, the row of dots is not what we are transcribing. The row of dots is part of the markup scheme. When we have three dots on their own, we are saying there are some illegible characters here that we are not transcribing. And so there is no text, there are no dots in the XML. Instead, that entire semantic statement is made by an XML tag, that this is a gap. There is a gap here because whatever text was there originally is now illegible, and the extent of that gap is unknown, or we might say the quantity of that gap is 3 characters or something similar. Again, likewise with square brackets where the gap is lost and angle brackets where the gap is 4 characters that were omitted. So I just wanted to stress the difference between those, and notice that those 3 gap elements on the first, third, and fifth lines of this table are all empty elements. They don't contain any text, as I just said, and they also have this slash right before the closing angle bracket, which says that they don't need a closing tag because they close with this same tag that they open with. Okay, I will pass on to Simona, who will talk a little bit about restorations and resolutions in EpiDoc.
Thank you, Gabby. Let me just quickly share my screen. Can you see everything?
Yep.
Okay. Apologies if there's noises around. There's work being done outside my window. I can't do anything about that. But I'll try to speak loud. So I just wanted to show a couple of cases where the markup is a bit more interesting and why we need to be careful when we tag our inscriptions, because sometimes it's not as straightforward as it might look, only substituting the Leiden with the XML. So in this example, we have a restoration of a lacuna, two of them in fact, on 2 lines. One of them, the end of the first word, aste, the second one, the end of the word on the second line. So you see how the stone is broken on the right-hand side, but the editor can still read those 2 words. So the editor is restoring those readings. And as Gabby just showed you, in Leiden, this type of restoration is marked by square brackets. So when we tag our inscription in EpiDoc, we just substitute the angle brackets with the equivalent XML tag. And for a restoration, that's the supplied with the attribute reason and the value lost. And as Gabby explained, the text which we are restoring is the content of this whole element. So the first one and the second one. That's clear enough for the time being, yep. So what happens though if we have a partially restored lacuna? So we have a restored word, but then we don't know if at the end of the line there were some other words, some other content. We don't know, so we put 3 dots enclosed in a square bracket, which means there's a gap due to some kind of damage. The same on the second line. We finish the restoration as much as we can, but then we just don't know if there was anything else. So in Leiden, in a printed edition, we would mark them up like this. We have the square bracket for the restoration, then a space, then the 3 dots for the gap, and then the closing square bracket. So what do? We mark up our restoration as we just saw, and then we have a gap because there are 2 separate things happening, right? Okay, so we have in the red, we have the XML for the gap, for the restoration. In the purple, something like purple, we have the markup for the gap. So we're saying there's a gap here, the reason is lost, so there's been some damage, the text is lost. We don't know the extent, but the unit is characters rather than lines or columns or anything else. However, we know that this markup, supplied reason lost content, close the supplied, this results in the Leiden in our content enclosed in square brackets. We also know that the markup for the gap results in 3 dots enclosed in square brackets. So if we mark them both separately, because they mean separate things, wouldn't we end up with something like this? So having the restoration and the gap next to each other, but having these middle brackets in the middle, which we wouldn't expect to see in an edition. So one way we might think that we could fix this is to have the gap inside the supplement like this in both cases. So we open the supplied, we have our content, we put the gap inside, close the supplied. However, that's wrong, because if we put the gap inside the supplied, that would mean that we are restoring the gap, which doesn't make sense. So the gap is a gap because there's been damage to the stone. This text doesn't exist anymore. We're not attempting to restore it. So we can't, semantically, it's just wrong to put it inside the supplied. What we should do is mark up the text as we did the first time round. We put our supplied text in the supplied tags, and then after that, we put the encoding for our gap. And then when we decide to display our XML into an edition online, the XSLT, the transformation that transforms our XML back into Leiden, takes care of those intervening middle brackets. So we get the display that we expect. However, we haven't changed the semantics of the edition. So we've kept the difference between a supplement and a gap, and the middle brackets are taken care of by the XSLT. The moral of the story being, always take care of the semantics, because that's what you do as an editor. What it looks like in the end in the edition, that's something that the XSLT takes care of. The second example I wanted to show you about, again, being careful about these things, is dealing with different abbreviations. So the first example is a simple abbreviation. We know that AUG is the abbreviation for Augustus. So how do we mark that up? We use 3 elements: aber for abbreviation, expand for expansion, and X for expanded text. So what we do is surround the entire word with the expand tag. Then the abbreviation, which is AUG, goes into the aber tag, and the expansion that we contribute to that word goes into the X. And when we display our text, the editorial display looks like this: Augustus with the expansion in parentheses, and the diplomatic display looks the way we expect an abbreviation to be originally displayed in our text. So you can see how to produce the editorial display. We need to have all of this marked up, both the abbreviation and the expansion and the whole word as an expanded word, to say this is one thing. Okay, however, we might have a case where we just can't expand the abbreviation because we have no idea what it's an abbreviation of. In that case, we only use the aber tag like this, and the display is the abbreviation with parentheses but no content inside the parentheses, rather than the hyphens, meaning it is an abbreviation, we don't know what to do with it. And in the diplomatic, we still see the whole word in capital letters as it exists without any intervention from the editor. If we have a more complex abbreviation, we need to add something extra to our markup. So going back to the emperors, we have AUGG, where the second G means we're talking about Augusti II rather than just one of them. So we already saw that for an abbreviation, we use the aber, the expand, and the X elements. Now, for something extra for the G that gives us the number of the Augusti, we need another element, AM, meaning abbreviation marker. How do we encode that? Again, we surround the whole thing in an expand attribute element. Then in the abbreviation, we have what's extant on the stone. So we have AUG, and then the second G as well, because that's part of the abbreviation. However, the second G we mark up with the abbreviation marker tag. And then in the X, we have our expansion of this abbreviation. In the editorial display, we will get Augusti II with our expansion in brackets and without the extra G, since the extra G means Usti II, basically. In the diplomatic, we get the 2 Gs, all capitals, no expansion, as we would expect. The moral of the story is exactly the same. So mark up the semantics, meaning that extra G, which is not part of the expansion when you expand it to a word. but don't worry about what it would look like while marking up, because the display is not part of the EpiDoc's job. That's the XSLT. So just a brief example of an entire inscription marked up in EpiDoc rather than these separate cases that I've shown you. So this is an inscription from the Crimean Peninsula. This is the image, and this is the Leiden. So there's some text missing, one O sort of in the middle of a line with some illegible characters either side. Over here at the top, you can see that. And then we have a lot of restoration going on. We have a couple of underdots, and here we have an abbreviation inside a restoration, which is interesting. So this is a case where we have a part of the name Demetrios, but we don't have the rest of the name. So here it may have said who his father was or where he was from or something. We don't know, so we've put square brackets, but instead of the gap, the editor has decided to say, since this is a personal name and we expect something else to go with Demetrios, as it's in the Greek tradition, I'm going to put not 3 dots, but I'm going to say Demetrios somebody, having the word somebody in parentheses. So not really an abbreviation, but some kind of additional comment in a supplement saying the gap that we have here contained a part of a personal name. So that's quite interesting. So what do we do with this in EpiDoc? So if this is slightly small on your screen, I've put a link underneath that directs you to the edition of this text, so you can have a look and go through it in more detail if that's too tiny on the screen. So I'm quickly going to walk you through the EpiDoc of this inscription. So at the top, we have our gaps, because as we saw, the stone is quite broken. And you can see that some of the gaps we have the reason is lost when there was damage, or we have the reason illegible, where there's a vestige of the letter, but it's not enough to attempt any kind of restoration. Right, so there's a lot of gaps. Then we have a personal name of a divinity, Serapis. And some of the name is supplied. If we go back, we can have a look at the Leiden and see that the S is restored. Arap is sort of on the stone, apart from the alpha, really. And then the rest is also restored. So going back to the XML, we see that the sigma is in a supplied reason lost. Then we have the underdotted alpha marked up as well. Then we have the wrap part of the name, which is still on the stone, and then the supplement of the ed at the end of the name. So you'll notice that there are no spaces between these elements, right? Because this is one word. You wouldn't expect to see a space in the middle of a name when it's just the one word like this. So one thing to note is that if you need to go on a new line in your XML editor, you can put a new line somewhere where it naturally appears, either between 2 words, as you would expect to see in your edition, or in an element just between the name of the element and one of the attributes, like I've done here with the supplied. Then I've put a new line before the reason lost, since there was already a space there. I wouldn't put a space after unclear, for example, because that would create a space over here in the middle of my word, and that would be wrong. So you see how the text inflates when you start marking up everything, every single feature like this, especially when you start to pay more attention to the personal names and places and add an additional information like that. which is why we recommend always to number your lines, like we've done here, according to the epigraphic lines. So that's good practice. You number your lines first, and then you start marking up, because otherwise, when you add all of these tags, it will be difficult to find your way. Okay, so we've seen how we encode a combination of supplements, unclears, and surviving text. So we have lots of names here, all of them in a combination of supplied and existing. And then, oh yes, I wanted to briefly show you what we've done with the restoration of Demetrius somebody. So you have here on line 4, we have personal name supplied because it was lost, them. Then we have the unclear eta, and then the rest of his name, Trios, is what we actually have on the stone. So that's the person's first name. And then the rest, we don't know, but we know that according to the Greek naming convention, there would have been something there. So we've put a supplied rather than just a gap, because we know the second part of his name would have been there if only we had that piece of the stone. So we have a supplied, and then, since that's an editor's comment rather than a restoration of something that actually existed, we've encoded it as a note saying to Deinos, so Demetrios somebody, son of somebody. Meaning we're not attempting to restore his father's name or where he was from or anything like that. We're just saying this gap isn't an ordinary gap, because we can guess what type of content there was in this place, but we can't restore it. So that I thought was something interesting to show. And in the last line, we have a gap as well. Okay, I think I will now switch to Lucia, who is going to show you how to work with the Papyrological Editor. Let me stop the screen share.
I share my screen. So, Papyri.info is a database of papyrus texts that makes use of contributions from students and researchers to update and enrich its collection. It's an extensive database of documentary papyri, a typology of text that comprises documents of ancient everyday life, like letters, tax receipts, petitions, etc. They're written on papyrus or on another easily portable medium like potsherds or ostraka in Greek. The documents included in Papyri.info are mainly in Latin and Greek, over 50,000 items, and there are also some Coptic and Demotic papyri. And work has started recently to add the Arabic papyri. And Papyri.info has become a point of reference for papyrological research, as it aggregates in one platform 3 major databases of documentary papyri, as well as providing links to external resources. The need to make the total corpus of documentary papyri instantly accessible, to search for textual parallels and documents of the same type, had led to the development of the Duke Databank of documentary papyri. But soon the need arose for a resource integration to allow simultaneous access through a single interface to databases that were separate from the Duke Databank, but whose content were related to each other. And this concern was addressed by the Integrating Digital Papyrology project, which since 2007, for 6 years, worked to convert the markup used for the Duke databank into an up-to-date standard markup specific for ancient texts, that is EpiDoc. And they worked to assemble the data provided by different databases into a single platform. So users have now access through Papyri.info to texts merged from the Duke databank and the metadata, that is contextual information to the texts, for example, on their provenance and dating. Metadata are provided by the Heidelberg Gesamtverzeichnis database and the University of Michigan APIS database. In addition to this, many translations for circa 7,000 texts are available through the Michigan APIS, which also provided images for 3,000 papyri. So texts and metadata were originally obtained from the aggregation of pre-existing databases. Now instead, new texts and metadata, or corrections to the existing ones, are added through users' contribution, with a procedure that includes an editorial vetting in order to meet scholarly standards. This model of collaborative editing, in part born out of the need for a sustainable way to maintain and update the database in the long term, has proved to be a new model of scholarly editing where the curation of a resource is distributed across a broader set of scholars, that is, anyone who is interested to participate. Furthermore, not only already published texts, corrections, and conjectures, as well as translations and notes, can be submitted, but also new ones proposed by users. And this makes the difference between a scholarly publication and a database more blurred. Rather than being a fixed data source, a database is viewed as a changing set of open data managed by the scholarly community. Texts can be edited from the XML code, which we can see on the right column for an example fragment. But an adaptation of XML, that is a markup language named Leiden Plus, has been created for papyrologists to allow them to work in a more user-friendly and tag-free environment. As we can notice, tags make the XML encoding a bit verbose, as for instance, the first line of the transcription of this text needs 5 lines of encoding in an XML environment, and they could be even more in other cases, whereas only 1 line of code with just small changes to the text are needed in the Leiden Plus transcription. Leiden Plus, as its name suggests, is a digital enhancement of the Leiden conventional system of critical marks to transcribe ancient texts. Many critical marks are the same as their Leiden equivalents. Others need little adjustments to enable the Leiden Plus markup to be automatically transformed into its equivalent XML tags correctly. Another advantage of Leiden Plus, as well as its usability for non-XML experts, is that it's possible to copy and paste from a text in digital format rather than typing it, which is at any rate possible as long as we use Unicode characters. So we now move on to see how we can enter new texts on Papyri.info. So from the home page, we choose Contribute Content, which will direct us to the Papyrological Editor, one of the 2 main components of the database, together with the Papyrological Navigator, which allows searching the collection. So we click on Contribute Content. Then to access the editing environment, we need to sign in. And this allows the contributions of each user to be clearly distinct, so that attribution is correctly preserved. Also, if you wish to continue your work later, in this way you can save your text in your space and then carry on from where you left off. Then we click on Advanced Create, and on Create New Publication. Even though texts can be edited from their XML code, we choose to work with the more user-friendly Leiden Plus markup. Then we copy and paste a text, for example, the text of this ostracon. And we need to add a few small changes. We add the line numbers to all the lines. And the dot after the number. Then in lines 1 and 4, we find abbreviated words. Abbreviated words, traditionally resolved by adding a pair of round brackets around the expansion, need to be enclosed into one more set of parentheses in Leiden Plus, because as we've seen, XML requires the entire word that is abbreviated to be marked up as well as an expanded abbreviation. And the extra set of brackets won't be displayed in the publication, as we can see in the preview. So I save and go to the preview. And as we can see, only one set of brackets is displayed. Then we go back to Leiden Plus. At line 1, we also find a correction by the scribe, who added a missing letter upsilon. We need to encode this information with the proper markup, that is with the 2 slashes. And this and other markup can be found listed in the Leiden Plus help menu. Then at line 4, a numeral occurs, theta for number 9. So we cancel the dash, which requires a specific markup. Then to encode the number, we go to markup and the numbers, and we enter here in this form the theta and its value. Now that the number is correctly encoded, we can add the markup for the dash. We go to symbols and the supralinear stroke. Then let's move on to another text with other interesting features, which I have already copied and pasted into the Papyrological Editor. In this other ostracon, we see that a few lacunas or gaps occur. For example, at lines 3 and 4, we see that there are lacunas at the end of the lines. And in papyrological practice, to transcribe a lost line end, we can just open a square bracket followed by a blank. We don't need to close the parentheses if we don't know the extension of the lacuna, as happens at lines 3 and 4. Instead, in Leiden Plus, we need to close properly all the brackets. In fact, Leiden Plus, like all markup languages, has a rigorous syntax which needs to be observed. Anyway, syntax errors are always noticed by the validation checker when we save our text. So when we try and save, a red banner is displayed to highlight a possible error. And also here, to express the unknown length of the lacuna, we add a dot followed by a question mark. Otherwise, if we know how many letters are lost, we need to indicate the relative number instead of the question mark, for example, 3. Finally, another adjustment we need to apply in the Papyrological Editor is exemplified in line 2. Here we have a case of a partially supplied lacuna. It contains both supplied letters and unknown characters. And from a papyrological standpoint, this is a lacuna, just like the lacunas which are completely restored or conversely not restored at all. As a lacuna in papyrology is always a physical gap in the papyrus, regardless whether it's supplied or not or in part. Instead, Leiden Plus, like EpiDoc and the other TEI XML languages, focuses on the text, on the content, rather than on the physical appearance. In other words, they are semantic markup languages rather than descriptive systems, a difference we saw in the first session on markup. And therefore, Leiden Plus considers textual and non-textual parts differently. So the dots that indicate the missing letters are considered in TEI XML as non-textual, so they need to be encoded differently from the supplied letters. And this affects the Leiden Plus markup. We need to separate the supplemented and unsupplemented letters that occur in a lacuna so that they can be transformed differently from one another in the background EpiDoc XML source code. So we must close the bracket after the end of the supplied text, and we open a new bracket for the lost letters. We add the markup for a lacuna of known length. And we find a similar case at line 3. An illegible letter is marked by papyrologists by a dot, as occurs here before the lacuna. As we've seen, this is different from the letters lost in a lacuna, as here traces of ink are visible, though we aren't able to identify the letters. This is, however, for XML a non-textual part, and so it's classified as a gap. Thus, we need to mark illegible letters with the specific markup. Dot followed by the number of illegible characters. We need to be careful in encoding these cases of lost and illegible letters, also because the validation checker doesn't detect errors of this kind, that is, semantic errors. And the semantic correctness can't be checked by the validator, and the text will be saved even with semantic mistakes. On the other hand, syntactic features are always noticed by the checker, as we saw about the square brackets not properly closed. Let's see now the submission process. So we need to save and go to publication overview.
Lucia, you might want to get rid of the original theta before you tag the number. It's just a small thing.
Sorry.
So where you tag the number on line 4, the original theta is still there.
Oh yes, yes. Okay, sorry. Oh, so we need to save again. And then publication overview. So the editing process ends with the submission to an editorial board. And for longer text, there's a double peer review, while shorter texts like Ostraka are reviewed by a single editor, and the process is more straight. The reviewers can accept the text if there are only minor corrections, if any, or they can send back the text to the user, asking for more important corrections, or they can reject the submission. When the text is accepted, it's published in the database with all its editorial history recorded. So we can see that in each record after the transcription, there is the editorial history with the name of the user who added the text and the person who reviewed it. And then we need to add a short description of the reason of submission. For example, that we entered the text from the edition. And so then the submit button is activated and we can send our transcription. Okay, that's the end of my presentation.
Great, thanks, Lucia. That's very cool. So yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about that is that what may not have been obvious if you were just watching Lucia marking up a papyrological text in Leiden Plus there, is that she was actually tagging the text in EpiDoc, just as Simona was with the epigraphic text that she showed before that. Just that Lucia was using a nicer interface that hid most of the tags from the screen. Once you pressed save, it was XML there again in the background. You just didn't need to see the XML. And so this is very useful for a site like Papyri.info, which wants input from people who don't want to learn XML, learn EpiDoc, and so forth in the process. So that's very cool. I want to now show one more thing that you can do in EpiDoc and in Papyri.info.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Given that you mentioned this, so as far as I see, you can use Leiden Plus as an interface, but can you visualize the XML while editing the text, or only after submitting the publication, and after the submission then you can download the XML? I don't know this. This is a question in the sense that
you can flip back and forth between the Leiden Plus and the XML in the thing. I'm gonna show the Papyrological Editor again in a moment, and so when I do that, I will show you exactly what I mean. So just as Lucia showed how you could switch between the Leiden Plus and the preview, there is also an XML view in there, and so I'll show again how you can flip between all three of those in a couple of minutes. Remind me if I don't. Okay. So yes, I want to introduce one more feature, which will also introduce the exercise that we suggest for this session. So first of all, I will just for a couple of slides, I will quickly introduce the concept of Apparatus Criticals in EpiDoc and then in Leiden Plus, which, as we've already seen, Leiden Plus is in fact EpiDoc. It's just a nicer interface for typing that EpiDoc. So the first thing to say is that just to clarify what we mean by Apparatus Criticals when we're talking about papyri, and for that matter, inscriptions, we usually mean Apparatus Criticals as something which records different scholarly opinions or attributes scholarly restorations and other emendations to text, as opposed to literary Apparatus Criticals, which are often showing manuscript variants and so forth in papyri and inscriptions, which are usually unique texts. Those kinds of apparatus entries are less common. So here's an example of a short papyrus entry. I don't remember which one it is. It's just something that plucked at random. Where you can see on the verso line 7, or it's called line 7 of the text because there are 6 lines on the recto, but the last word of that line before the number, in the text you have Kuri, and in the Apparatus Criticals it says BL 1260 and Kuri Prev Ed. Kuri slightly differently marked out. Leave aside the fact that this is such a tiny difference between the two that many of us might think it's absurd to have an editorial correction here. Even though it's a small difference, that does matter for the reading of a difficult text like this. So what's going on here is effectively that the current edition is saying Kuri, as we see, where the editor says, I can see Kappa Omicron Epsilon Rho on the stone, and this is an abbreviation for Kuri. So I am expanding, I am resolving this abbreviation with the addition of an iota to the end. There is then a footnote, and that footnote says in the apparatus that this reading, Kur with an iota at the end, is from Berichtigungsliste XII, volume 12, page 60. And it additionally says that the previous edition, and it doesn't specify which, but presumably means editio princeps, not necessarily, had previously read that line as Kappa Omicron Upsilon visible on the stone, and the rho iota were restored. Were resolved, not restored. That it was an abbreviation with only. And so, as I say, that's a very small difference, but you can see what's going on there. So that's how you display that. You have the text in the body of the papyrus edition shows the reading that we now favour, and in the apparatus we say who gave that new reading and what the previous reading was. Okay, the previous and less favoured reading. It could even be a later and less favoured reading. That can also happen, but in this case, I think it's probably previous. So to encode that in EpiDoc, we'd say something like, and apologies for the line break in the middle of the second line there. That was unintentional. We say that this is an apparatus entry, so we have this app element, which means an apparatus entry. We say the location of this is the verso line 7, as you saw in the apparatus. We have the lemma, and the lemma means the reading which is in the text, and the source of that is BL 1260, and that says Kuri with the iota in parentheses. Well, in EpiDoc, we would mark that up as an abbreviation in full, as you saw in Simona's example earlier. But just for readability, I'm just using Leiden inside the apparatus because it's only the apparatus I'm demonstrating at the moment. We then have the second reading, which is not the reading in the text, and so it's given a different tag, RDG, with the less favoured reading, Kuri, the previous reading. And then the app closes, because this is one apparatus entry. You can have multiple apparatus entries on a single text. Okay, so that's the XML. It's a little bit cumbersome, but you can see, I think, everything that's going on there. If you can understand the semantics, you have the apparatus entry has a location, you have the lemma that has a source, you have a reading which could also have a source. In this case, it doesn't. That's why we have to guess that it means the editio princeps. But if we were fully responsible, we would say what the source is for the reading as well. And you have the two pieces of Greek in the middle of that. So we can see that, but again, you can see how most papyrologists might not want to type all of this if they wanted to create a digital edition of this text. It might be a little bit too much to ask them to learn this. So Leiden Plus, again, gives us a much simpler solution to this. It's not quite as simple as the Leiden Plus solution to square brackets, which is square brackets, or to underdot, which is underdot, but it's still simpler than the XML. So this is what the Leiden Plus would look like. Apologies for the strangely placed circumflex accents on this. I hadn't seen that before. So again, the color coding is here just to break up the semantics of this. It's all just plain text in reality. So we have this angle bracket with a colon at the beginning and end, and this tells us that this is an apparatus entry. Okay, we have the good reading that we like on the left, and it's now written in Leiden Plus with the double parentheses, not just in plain Leiden. The previous reading that we don't like as much on the right, again in Leiden Plus. In the middle, we have something to say this is an editorial correction, and you'll see in a minute there's other kinds of apparatus entry that we can include as well. And here, after the good reading, we say where this reading is from. We could also say where the less good reading is from. Okay, and so that's the Leiden Plus encoding of that. This again, you can all get this from the helper that Lucia showed you a minute ago. But that's this is a fairly good model that you can just follow for this. The other kind of apparatus entry that you can have in a papyrological edition, the most common one, is indicating alternative readings or editorial uncertainty about readings. So here, for example, the first one, there's several of these in the same text, but just using the first one on line 1, you see graphe at the beginning of line 1, where in the apparatus it says or para. And so what it's saying is the current edition reads graphe, but the apparatus says this could also read para. It's not saying a previous editor said that, it's saying the current editor can't quite make up their mind between the two, and so puts graphe in there first because they think that maybe that's marginally more likely, or just it comes first alphabetically or whatever, but that it could also read para, and they don't want to commit themselves to the two. So again, in EpiDoc, we use the app element. We say the type is that it's an alternative, and there is a lemma, which is the one we put in the text that says graphe. There's a reading, which is the one we don't put in the text, which says para. We don't put a source attribute on either because they're both the current editor. It's not that we've taken one of these from somewhere else. And simply that's all we need to say about it. In Leiden Plus, we use exactly the same construction, just a slightly different syntax. And we say, there's the blue angle bracket colon to tell us this is an apparatus entry. You have the alt in the middle surrounded by vertical pipes to say that this is an alternative reading as opposed to an editorial correction. And on the left is the lemma, graphe, and on the right is the other reading, para. Okay, and this again is a model you can just copy from, or something you can show in the get from the helper that Lucia showed you earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a page of the Berichtigungsliste, which is a volume of minor corrections to papyri in the major corpora that is compiled once every 5 years or so, and has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of entries of this kind. I'm going to take some from volume 12. I've given a page of this, or 2 pages of this this volume to each of my students to enter as well. If anyone else would also like some pages to enter, do drop me an email and I can send you some pages as well to do this exercise. The reason we're not all doing the same text is because when you enter these corrections in Papyri.info and submit them, they will really be in there. So we will be improving the Apparatus Criticals in the Duke Databank of Documentary Papyri via this exercise. And this is something we wanted to talk about as much as possible for this semester, is how the work we are doing in learning how to use these digital classics tools is contributing real content to research databases that people use. So this is an example of a page of the Berichtigungsliste. You see along the top here, it tells you which papyrus collection we're talking about, and on the left we have the number of the papyrus, and in some cases we also have the line number of the papyrus that's being talked about. In many of these cases, you see, you may not be able to read this because it's very small, but in many of these cases, what they're saying in the Berichtigungsliste is that there's this may form a links to some other text, or that there may be a photograph of it somewhere else, or here you can find some other information, or that an editor has added commentary to this. And these aren't things that we can do anything about. The kind of apparatus entries that we can do something about are the ones that are given just at the bottom of this, and I will zoom in on the bottom of the page there. This is from a volume called P. Gis Apol. And text number 1 in this corpus has 3 corrections, one on line 7 to 8, one on line 12, and one on line 13, which you can see from the construction. Let's look at line 13 because it's the easiest to see what's going on. We have, it says line 13, epi heautu, which is what was in the original corpus, is now to be read as, that arrow says, epi sautu, according to Loxit, which refers back to Dieter Hagedorn in ZPE 136 from 2001, pages 149 to 50. So all 3 of these corrections come from Dieter Hagedorn in the same volume. What I suggest we do, if when you've gone through your pages you find this this sort of correction with the little arrow, or with the word viel for vielleicht, saying this is, an alternative reading. This is an editorial correction. If it says viel, that means that it's an alternative reading that's being offered, which we can add using the second mechanism I talked about. And so we can enter these into the Papyrological Editor. If you have room on your screen, I might suggest you open a separate window with this page on and pause it, so you can be looking at this page, or if you download the slides, if you're not watching this live, you can be looking at this page while you see what I'm doing on the other screen at the same time. So I'm going to have to stop screen sharing briefly so that I can share a different window. And I want to share this window. Will this work? No, it won't, because it's Firefox. Okay. Let's see whether Papyri.info works in a different browser. Hang on. I have several times this series been stymied by the fact that Firefox seems not to work anymore for almost anything. Just be a moment. I need to log out. Log into a different account. See whether this works. If this doesn't work, it's going to be slightly awkward because I don't think I can do this in Chrome. Let's try this again, see whether this works. Okay, now you can see the Papyri.info page on my screen, right? Yep. Okay. Apologies for that digression. So what I'm going to do here is just as Lucia did, I'm going to go to, well, actually I'm going to go via a different route. I'm going to go into the Duke Data Bank. I'm going to find P. Gis Apol, which was the text we were looking at, and I'm going to find P. Gis Apol 1, which was the specific text that had the 3 corrections that we saw. And this is the entry for P. Gis Apol 1. As you can see, there's the text. I mean, it currently has no apparatus entries to it, so I'm going to add...
Sorry.
Yeah.
We still see the homepage of Papyri.info. We don't see the text.
Really?
Yep.
How odd.
Yeah, it's frozen on that page.
I guess I can stop screen sharing and start again. Now you can see P. Gis Apol, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, okay, I hope that's not going to happen every time I go to a new page in this browser, but let's see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this link up here at the top, which you're not seeing, are you? Because it's not showing you that I've scrolled the page.
No, it doesn't show that.
Fabulous. So, okay, I undo screen share, I go back to here. So now you can see the link at the top of the page. I click on Open in Editor, and I stop screen sharing, start screen sharing again so you can see the editor. I need to say that I'm logging in. I get a pop-up saying that I'm logging in. I probably will see the pop-up and you won't, but I will refresh this in a minute. This is farcical. Irritatingly, I can't use Chrome, which would work because I'm logged into Chrome as Sunoikisis. Okay, so what you see when you get this is the editing interface for Papyrological 1, and I will select on this the link to Leiden Plus, and then when the Leiden Plus loads, I will stop screen sharing and start screen sharing again so you can see it. And I guess I should zoom in a bit so you can see the text a bit better, but of course it doesn't zoom you in on this is kind of ridiculous, but okay, so you can see the text here that I've zoomed into, and there are changes to make on lines 7 to 8 and 12 and 13. Looking at this, however, the text, I mean, if you compare it to the screenshot I showed you earlier, the text on lines 7 to 8 here is not the same as the text in the apparatus that we saw in Berichtigungsliste. So I'm not going to touch line 7 to 8 because there's something else going on. An editor will probably want to look at that. It has already been corrected since Berichtigungsliste recorded this change. That's not the case for lines 12 and 13, however, which I need to unscreen share in order to show. There must be a better way to do this. I suspect that Google Hangouts and YouTube have just deliberately decided not to work with any browser other than Chrome because it's their own browser. But that aside, so what we're going to do is we have here in the middle of line 12, we have Apopempfair read by the original editor, and Hagedorn thinks this should instead read soy pempfair, with no missing characters, but the iota unclear. And so I'm going to correct that by typing the new version in there. Of course, when I start typing in here, you won't see what I'm typing because the page isn't refreshing. So I'm going to type it and then refresh the browser so you can see what I've typed. I can't refresh the screen share every keystroke, and so I'm typing soy now I need to remember how to get that iota subscript, and no, actually I can just copy it from the end of the line. And I want a underdot under the iota of soy. So what I have done is I have created, as we discussed last time, the construction soy. I've mistyped that. I typed a mu instead of a p. Let me go back to that. I've corrected it. You can't see that I've corrected it, but I have. You'll see it again in a moment. So soy penth there on the left. This is what we now want in the text, and the old reading was apopenthe on the right. I then want to add, after the new reading, the good reading, soy penth there, that this is a reading from Hagedorn in ZPE, where is it from? 136 2001, pages 149 to 150. And this is now longer than the screen, but you will get the idea. So here is the, sorry, I'll have to refresh my browser so you can see it. So I've said soy penth there, from Hagedorn ZPE 136 2001, 1949 to 50, 149 to 150, editorial correction, and there's the old reading on the right-hand side of that. Okay, and you can see that's the same construction as I created a little bit earlier. I'm going to try saving that, and I get a validation confirmation that that's okay. I won't make the second correction just now. Actually, why don't I make the second correction? Because then I can show you, if you don't mind this taking a couple of minutes longer than we had scheduled. I'll make the correction on line 13 as well. So on line 13, we have, what did it say? Okay, epi heautu, we correct to epi sautu. So this is even easier because I can just copy and paste most of it. So we have a new reading, which is from Hagedorn, and we have the old reading, sorry, you can't see me typing or copying and pasting as I am in this case, but I will refresh it in just a moment. I think I just changed it from epi heautu to epi sautu, yeah. Okay, let me just quickly refresh the screen share. And you can see I've done exactly the same thing. I've said epi sautu, the reading from Hagedorn, and on the right over there, which you can't see, it's just off the screen, was the old reading epi heautu. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is save this, and again it will tell me that this is valid, yes. And I'm then going to go to the top of the screen and select the preview button as Lucia showed you earlier. And what happens there is you can see that it has created two apparatus entries that says this good reading, which was up in the text just off the screen, is by Hagedorn. The previous edition said apopenthe. Okay, so it is correctly rendered as we would expect the Duke Databank to render the editorial readings that way. I also want to quickly, as Monica requested, show the XML for this. So I will find the right place in the XML and yeah, I'm just putting in some line breaks so you can see it all without me having to scroll around. Let me just refresh the screen share again. And so there's the XML that it has created from this same thing. So app type editorial, the lemma says that this is the responsibility of Hagedorn, ZP136, etc., saying epi sautu, and that the previous editor, it doesn't say who that is, said epi heautu in the earlier reading. Okay, so you can switch between all these views. I've saved it in between. You have to save before you can switch to another view, but I haven't submitted anything in order to switch to the. And I could also edit it here if I wanted. I notice here, for example, that at the end of line 13, the circumflex over the upsilon seems to have moved to be over the angle bracket of the apparatus instead. So I could correct that in the XML. That's something which was invisible to me in the Leiden Plus, but in the XML it's there, so I've corrected it. I save it, it tells me that's valid. Where was that? That was at the end of line 13. If I refresh the screen share, you see the circumflex has now gone back to over the upsilon where it belongs. And if I go back to the Leiden Plus, that's also fixed in there. Wait, I haven't gone back to Leiden Plus. Okay, it's now telling me there's an error in the Leiden Plus. Okay, so I can't demonstrate that because I think this is probably a browser thing that has caused that error. I have no idea. So, okay, let me undo any changes that I had made in here and all these line breaks that I put in, and try and save that again. Again, you're not seeing what I'm doing, but okay, but that seems to have fixed it. So okay, I'm now. Apologies for this refreshing of the screen share, which has slowed this down a lot. So we're back at the Leiden Plus and everything's fine again. So the only thing I want to show now, just very, very quickly, is when you've made these changes and you are completely happy with them, if at any point you have any doubts or any questions, then don't submit your changes. You save them, but don't submit the changes. So you can save them. There's a save button on this page, at the top of the page here. Sorry, I have to refresh the screen share so you can see it's at the top of the page here. Is the save button. Save it as often as you like, because this just saves your copy. But when you want to submit this to the repository, to the database, you go back to the overview button at the top of the page, which takes you back to this page where you started, which looks like this, and which Lucia also showed you earlier. And you can comment in this field why you have submitted. So added 2 editorial corrections from BL 12, page 7, on lines 12 and 13. Did not add the correction to line 28 because the BDP already came for recent changes than the text. So just having some comment in there so that the editors can see what I'm doing. So you see I've added a comment there, and as Lucia showed, once the comment has been entered, the Submit to Boards button becomes active, and I can click on that button and submit to the boards. At this point, I can no longer edit the text. It says publication submitted, And I can no longer go in and edit and make changes to this until those changes have been accepted by the editor, the editorial board. Okay, so apologies that took longer than it should have done. That was partly my fault for talking too much and partly a problem with the browsers, but I will stop there. We've already gone over time, but if anyone has any comments or questions, particularly about the exercise, does anyone want to add anything? The only thing I would reiterate is that please don't press that submit button unless you're absolutely sure what's going on. If you have the slightest hesitation, then talk to your tutor, whether that's me or someone, your local tutor, wherever you are, before you do so. It's good. It's, you know, it won't break anything because the editorial board will look at it and they will see if there's any problems with it. But it's better to waste our time than to waste their time. So that's the only thing I would stress. Monica, were you going to say something?
Well, we are late, but I have a provocative question in general about Leiden Plus. So I like Leiden Plus, but it's very similar to the original Leiden. So in the sense that XML is different, of course, XML, you use XML to represent Leiden, but you use tags and other things. I think, this is my impression, that Leiden Plus is very similar to traditional Leiden, is the machine-readable Leiden in some way. So at the beginning, when you use Leiden Plus, you can be a bit confused. I think, but maybe in Papyri.info, there are guidelines, of course, but I think that in the future we need a sort of publication to say, this is the new version of Leiden, this is the machine-readable Leiden. In the history of Leiden, of the Leiden Conventions, I think we need something like that. I don't know, this is my impression. Of course, when you start using Leiden Plus and you get used to it, it's easy to learn, but sometimes I don't know if you understand what I mean. So
I do. What I would stress in this case, and which I do when I teach people to use the Papyrological Editor, and Lucia may have other comments on this, but what I would stress about this is that I don't see Leiden Plus as being a new version of Leiden, and I definitely don't see Leiden Plus as being a new version of XML. What Leiden Plus is a user-friendly interface, editing interface for editing what is on the top of the EpiDoc. Okay, and so you could change some of the symbols that you use in Leiden Plus without changing the underlying EpiDoc. The encoding is still EpiDoc. The display is still Leiden. Leiden Plus is just this user-friendly interface. Yeah. Think of it as if you have a Microsoft Word-like interface over the top of a LaTeX editor. Okay, you're creating LaTeX, but you don't see the LaTeX on your screen. You see what you want to see. Yeah. And although this isn't exactly Leiden, because that would be a little bit too ambiguous for a direct conversion to EpiDoc, it is very close to that, and. So I'd be a little bit careful how to phrase that. So yes, some people do think of that as being, yes, it's additions to Leiden, but I mean in some ways it's false. It's poorly named. It shouldn't be called Leiden Plus. It should be called EpiDoc Minus.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. I totally agree with you. But for people who start using Leiden Plus and for people who are used to the traditional Leiden, this is something that we have to explain, to clarify.
Yes. Yes,
but I agree with you. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Lucia, do you want to add anything to that? Any comment about the role of Leiden Plus and maybe some of the user studies you've done? Have you found people confused about what Leiden Plus is?
Well, yes, I have to say that it was a bit difficult at the beginning to learn. Yes, but we need workshops, and so at the beginning, yes, it's a bit difficult also because the interface in comparison, for example, with the Proceeds interface, it hasn't got some features like the nesting and the syntactic highlighting for different elements. So that would be a help for users. And also a thing that a user noticed is that it's not clear the possibility to see the preview because the button was on top and a bit smaller. And even if you find it, you need to click twice. And so, yes, that was a bit confusing, while one prefers to see both at the same time, and the Leiden Plus environment and the preview, or anyway with only one passage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. That's useful. I'm sure this is feedback that will be useful to the designers of the interface. And I say that in the third person, although I was initially one of the designers of Leiden Plus. I didn't design, and I certainly no longer have any maintenance responsibilities with anything in Papyri.info itself. So yeah, I think it would definitely, that sort of feedback is exactly the sort of thing they need, and will very much appreciate when your thesis comes out with all of that in it. Okay, well, we've definitely gone over time now, and some of us have to run across town to celebrate something unrelated. So I will probably close this now. Thank you all very much. Next week we will have an introduction to tree banking from Polina Jordanova and Maria Vieros from Polina's from Sofia University and the Institute of Classical Studies, and Maria is from the University of Helsinki. And so that will be there'll be more tree banking coming in following weeks as well. So see you all next week. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.